Hi, everybody. I am Christy Craig. I'm the publisher here at Hidden Timber Books, and I want to thank you for being here on a Thursday evening. Usually I do these during the day on the weekend, so we were just talking about the lighting. It's kind of weird and whatnot, but I'm grateful to be here. We're all working with different time zones, so it's nice that we can come together at any time. The Hidden Timber Book Small Press Author Reading Series has been a really great series, a way to introduce readers to authors from all over who you may or may not get a chance to see at your local indie bookstore. And it's been a great way to kind of build literary communities. So thank you for supporting us in that way of being here. And I've put some links in the waiting room for you to check out Nathaniel Popkin's book and Jesse DeLong's book. And I will put those in again so you can look at that later if you would like to. So today's a little bit different. We've got two authors here that I think are well paired together, and we're going to just kind of do a little back and forth. And so if you see me fidgeting, I'm just trying to make sure I'm hitting the right buttons. So tonight we're going to begin first with Jesse DeLong. He is the author of the Amateur Scientist Notebook. And I just want to show you the cover of the book while I read his bio. It's just a beautiful cover. Jesse DeLong grew up in northern Idaho and western Montana. He holds a BA in English from the University of Montana and an MFA in poetry from the University of Alabama. He has published several chapbooks and artist books, and his poems have appeared in the Colorado Review, the Mid-American Review, and more. And I love this cover. His book is published by, and Jesse, you have to tell me, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Tell me what the name, how you pronounce the name of the.
It's Baobab, like the tree.
Baobab, thank you.
Yeah.
So Baobab Press. And Jesse, thank you for being here. I just wanted to ask you first off, if you want to share a little bit about yourself or how you came to write this book.
Yeah, thanks. I guess first I just want to say, thanks Christy and Hidden Timber Books for having us here. Thank you, Nathan, for reading with me, and for everybody who's sort of watching now and will watch later on the recording. I started writing this book when I was in grad school, sort of towards the end of my time at the University of Alabama. I finished about sort of the first draft of it there, but had been just working on it a while. One of the things that I was doing, I had sort of imagined it as one long poem. When I first started, I thought it would just be sort of a 60-page poem that I would write. But as I was writing it, it sort of became, obvious as I was writing that a lot of the poems wanted to be on their own, even though sort of thematically, I think sort of it is sort of like its own full arc and argument. One of the things I was doing while I was writing it was trying to sort of appropriate some different forms. So one of those will be one of the tables that we look at today. Sort of I was taking reading different sort of scientific textbooks or scientific books and sort of like mining them for some graphs and some charts that I could then appropriate into the poems. So I guess I'm going to start with Field Guide to the Southeastern Idaho Phosphate District. If you have the book, it's on page 33 as the start, but I'm going to read the second poem on page 34. This is a serial poem, so it has a larger overarching title, but then each of the sort of individual poems in the larger poem have their own titles. So I'm going to start out with Structural Setting of Bird in Phosphor. Most field guides illustrate the events influencing a landscape, but how can we relay what needs said without sounding like we've scavenged the husk of a roadside whitetail? Do you believe, as Freud did, that we are self-destructive, acid-lined and rooted deeply beneath what we consciously perceive? To frame it this way, the senses are an illusion. We want to fuck our mothers not because they are so, but because sex is a sort of death, and how dare they create and get away with it? Or, like Skinner, do we only seek out whatever gives us pleasure, a species of hedonists, no morals other than dopamine? Aren't they the same? The times you begged me, and it was a begging, to pin your wrist to the mattress, to overrule your breath with the sound of gravel. I am not who you think I am, and so I hurt you. You are not who I think you are, and so you hurt me. Like a dog salivating at the sound of a bell, I realized that when you bruised my most tender of organs, you saw me, hairy chest and stench of dick, as I saw myself, and I was happy. We called this a history of intimacy and thought about it as we drove by the phosphate mines. Men emerged from Earth wheezing because the air was too bright. They were not used to being treated this way and drove home to their families who glowed so white that the men had to shield their eyes, sons with clean fingernails, daughters tragic enough to date boys who wanted to be minors, wives who hated hearing canaries sing because it sounded too much like their own names. Seething. You, a woman who cannot, call me when I am getting into bed. You're about to fail at something important, not because you can't, but because you don't think very much of how your hair falls. And see how hard it is to say this? The moment I try to, air fills my mouth, and somewhere, possibly beneath the mine slag in your lungs, you know this is true, and I am just being honest. If you make me feel terrible, I might feel about you the way you feel about white girls walking out of a smoothie and tan shop. That is, you are free to be loose. We talk about it one night when the road is closed off. No returning where we need to. No sound anywhere, but for both of us, this is the better part, the way we love each other's gaps. Dry Valley Mine. 1. The air, sandpaper, walking through a cornfield in late autumn. 2. Hair uncombed, lips blue with sleep. You smeared the suds from my fingers on your dress and went to bed. Night, all of it. I heard you scuttling, trying to find sheets that didn't feel like a moth in the gut. I got up and turned on the lamp, its light gulping the room. When I couldn't stand the way you looked in it, I walked outside. At the fence, a caribou, fur scraggy, ribs pressing on skin like a man trying to force his hands through. The caribou must have wanted something to hold off its hunger for sleep. Approaching it, I displayed my empty palms. I offered it what I offer you. So just migrate. Somewhere in the Selkirk Mountains, my uncle stepped off his snowmobile, took a sip of the coffee he brought with him in a thermos. He was a man who believed in Bigfoot, and the snow was falling hard around him. His breath rose through the scarf snug to his mouth, the fabric wet from breath. When he turned towards his vehicle, he saw in the snow a footprint larger than his boots. A few seconds, and the snow filled it in. This was the story he told me when I told him that the last herd of caribou left in the lower 48 had abandoned that range of mountains. They were tired of eating lichen, hearing the loud noises of engines, knowing that cougars found it easier to stalk the packed tracks of a snowmobile. Everything moves on eventually, he said, and looked at me, a man who had come to get drunk with him because my girlfriend had left me for the second of several times. Sometimes what you need and what you feed on aren't in the same area, he said. Enoch Valley Mine. This is the last of this poem series that I'll read. There are times when you are heavier with booze, breath the weight of its own opening, how I never taste the inner ridge where minerals are, how I excavate too harshly and without the proper tools. Even when I finally have what I've been secluding myself from the sun for, I don't know how to handle it, the weight too dissimilar to my own. I want to unearth you in an orange dress sewn for the plateaus, like a hunk of sky chunked through a mine shaft surface vent. You blare too much of the nutrients I've been starving of.
Thank you. I was writing a lot of different quotes down that stand out to me. Senses are an illusion, not used to being treated this way. I love these words, mind slag in your lungs. And you just paint very vivid images. And, you know, this book is a lot about what I see anyway, just the way the landscape defines or rules the thoughts and memories, and the way that you weave it into the personal experience is really beautiful.
Thank you.
One of the questions I have for you, Jesse, is, reading from your bio, I know that you've lived in several different places. So when you think about landscape and its effects and on memories or relationships, do you find that you respond differently in different places as far as, like the filter that you look through to see the world around you? Is it different, or is it the same perception that you carry just in different areas?
No, I think it's really different. I think that where you live really has an effect on your consciousness and sort of how you perceive the world. I think sort of anybody that has lived in the West in areas of like Montana and Idaho sort of know how that sort of openness can affect the way you live your life, the way you make relationships and stuff like that. And these are going to be much different than sort of, say, if you live in the city, some sort of larger city or something like that. This poem, obviously, I grew up in northern Idaho and western Montana, but sort of like growing up mostly through high school and everything, I was in northern Idaho. I grew up in the sort of Sagal area at the tip of Idaho near Canada, and our house was sort of tucked up right near the mountains there. And this book sort of brings in a lot of those sort of experiences as of me growing up and sort of my dealing with the landscape there.
Thank you. It's very nice. So I want to introduce you all to Nathaniel Popkin, and I want to pull up his cover as well. And a little bit about Nathaniel. Nathaniel Popkin is a writer and editor of fiction and nonfiction, film, criticism, and journalism. Nathaniel Popkin explores memory and loss, urban and historic change, architectural palimpsests, and ecological grief, and the struggle for the democratic ideal. In an essay in the New York Times, he describes the present eco-crisis as the age of loss. His book, To Reach a Spring, is an urgent and deeply felt call to face our complicity in the Earth's destruction. So, Nathaniel, thank you for being here. I know that there is a question in the chat from Douglas, and so after Nathaniel, after you read, we'll get to Douglas, your question. Thank you for putting that in there. So just to get us started, I'd like to ask you kind of the same question as far as a little bit about who you are and a little bit about this journey through writing this book, how that went for you.
Thanks, Christy. I really appreciate being here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here with you guys and to read with Jesse, whose work is so striking. There certainly were images in what he just read that will not depart from my mind for a long time. And what I've chosen to read basically is I'm going on the mining theme for what I'm going to read, but I have been when I was a young kid, or a young adult, I guess is what I mean by that, is I was an environmental activist, and that meant running a field office of canvassers to raise money to support legislation to state and national and local levels, which I did for a while, and I found it frustrating. And over the years have been involved in different activist modes, with an increasing sense that we're stuck, we're paralyzed. And there are real structural reasons for that paralysis that have to do with capitalism, that have to do with sort of neoliberalism, that have to do with I guess you would say, like limits on the regulatory state, that have to do with the whole way that we live our lives. For example, the automobile and the way the automobile has set us up to live in the United States particularly means that most people have to drive wherever they go, no matter what. And that sort of locks us in to a relationship to the earth. In the last few years, there's been a lot of thinking, theorizing about how we can reimagine our human relationship to the earth. And of course, that's a really fraught and difficult question, because when we say human, what do we mean? Who do we mean? Who are we talking about? Who's, as Jesse said, where you grow up, no matter if that's in the United States or elsewhere, it sort of frames your point of view. And so when we say we must do X to fix the situation, who are we talking about? And so all these things have been really, really playing at my heart for a long time. And so a couple of years ago, I sat down and started writing what became a book-length essay to reach the spring. And it's meant to be like a little helping hand, an invitation to think along with me as to how to think about, how to think about the climate emergency and the ecological crises, many of them, that in tandem are changing the very, very nature for all creatures on Earth. So, and to do this, I spend time with poetry, with theory, with philosophy, with history. I'm sort of digging into my bag of tricks and trying to pull out anything I can to help us along in thinking about this, from present events, from COVID to the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, to the Holocaust, to the Black Plague, to the colonization of the Americas, to the consumerification of American people. All of that is part of this book, which is just a kind of thinking piece. And I invite you to think along with me. So Jesse will read another section, and so we'll alternate. And I sort of chose my sections based upon what he was reading. And because he wrote with a kind of mining theme, I chose this reading from the end of, or near to the end of the book, which is about what we think of what we're doing when we're trying to master the earth, which is kind of at the very core of the idea of mining. And then another kind of strategy for dealing with this issue that faces us, which I call melancholy. So I'm going to read for a little bit, and then happy to talk more and hand it back over to Jesse, and we move through the night. Thank you all for your patience and interest. So great to be here. Okay, so this is in a chapter that is called "I Am Not a Commodity," and it's picking up mid-paragraph here. Our business is to turn money into more money, and we do it chiefly by extracting earth materials and smothering earth systems easily and quickly with the machinery of our invention. We call this mastery. Mastery is the highest human achievement. Mastery, leading so often to the desire for an achievement of efficiency above all, creates a smoothness to human predation of Earth. Technology allows us to exploit the planet's resources with calibrated ease. The calibrated smoothness is the end in itself. This is why we marvel at the genius of engineering. As a high achievement of modernity, it separates our hands from the dirty work. The mesmerizing machine becomes the end in itself. We focus on its quantitative achievements of scale, speed, and accuracy, and lose track of what the machine is actually doing to Earth. This is the terror of mastery, a globe encased in concrete. Writing in the early 1970s in the exquisite Invisible Cities, Italo Calvino represented the eternally grinding engine as endless urban sprawl, one undistinguished city form running into the other, obliterating the landscape with vague buildings. The imagined apotheosis is Penthelicea, a continuous city, so undefined that it appears to the resident or visitor only the outskirts of itself. To experience such a formless city, as I'm reminded each time I cross the Delaware River and find myself on the long commercial highways of South Jersey, is to be precisely dehumanized. Going along one overscaled intersection after the other, I feel my power, spontaneity, and desire draining out. The blood pooling at this traffic light and then that one and the next, the very opposite of the freedom I felt as a teenager behind the wheel for the first time. Bloodless. This is the feeling the perfect machine produces of killing something already substantially dead. It is in fact numbing and mindless and depleting. The ache that it produces is the weight of melancholy. And this is well before total catastrophe has happened. Once the black, I'm going to take a little detour to the Middle Ages. Once the black rats started to die in the middle of the 14th century, it took several weeks for the rat fleas to nibble a little Yersinia pestis and plant a deadly kiss. As the epidemic spread from Sicily in 1347 to booming Tunis in 1348, into Algiers and Tangier, and then to Sevilla and Cordoba in 1349, it left towns and cities in ruins, according to the historian Robert Irwin, and nothing, it seemed, could stop it. No wisdom or forbearance, no acts of prayer. To Muslimize particularly, the ruins came to represent monarchical injustice, writes Irwin in Ibn Khaldun, evidence of man's corruption and incompetent government. Here was failure written on the landscape. And not only failure, but horrifying loss of all that was assumed to comprise the world, including fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, friends and foes. The impossibility of this loss became the source of extreme melancholy for both Muslims and Christians, a muted humbling, an ache for what was and what can't be. There wasn't much to do but wait for the end times. Driving recently in Central Florida, where 4 and 5 and 6 and 7-lane roads go on in eternal Penthesilean horror, one undistinguishable from the next. A Walgreens at every third intersection, and the space between them chained with new car dealerships, auto garages, oil change and lube franchises, body shops and gas stations, pale buildings back to back in mangy fields, as Calvino precisely imagined it, mangy fields, as Calvino precisely imagined it. I had the distinct feeling that the end times had finally come. With each subsequent traffic light, the glare dull yet somehow piercing, the haze immobilizing, I grew more and more weary. Sedans, pickups, and SUVs bloated my vision in all directions. I crept along in a plastic and metal machine across the snuffed out ground. And was it still ground, slicked with petrol and crushed gravel? Yes, only somehow inside out. For a while, I cursed at those who had done this to us, who had sacrificed La Tierra Florida for Florida, the state of Florida. Then recognition emerged as a kind of salvation. Melancholy was a matter of mind, a mechanism of survival, this act of refusing hope. Florida produces melancholy because it might be Florida, or more precisely, Florida is still there, somewhere, in blotches of Spanish oaks, in sweeps of marsh, and the perfuming heat itself. Melancholy is produced by beauty that can't be manifest. It fundamentally quiets human ambition. Manifest as ache in speech, song, art, and poetry, it absolves us of the need for mastery. For pessimism doubts the virtue agency.
Again, I like to take notes when I listen to someone read, and the things that stood out to me: the machines separate our hands from the dirty work, and the ache that produces the melancholy. And then what I really loved is that you write about the failure written on the landscape and that horrifying loss. And that makes me think about we we have a place up in the UP, my in-laws do. It's beautiful up there in the northern woods. And there, there was always this walk that you could take. It's about like 5 miles altogether, but you could kind of go back in this secluded area of the woods, all these beautiful pines, and this one lane bridge around this little, it's just perfect. And one of my favorite walks. And then one year the loggers just took it all down. And so as soon as you walk in, it was just stumps. It was like a cemetery. And then that feeling, that loss of like that protection in some way of everything was gone. But it was really, really sad. But then, you write about Florida is still there, and that's the truth. It's amazing how much that landscape has transformed in the last 5 years. Just letting it grow back and take over the space again, which I really appreciate. So it just sort of made me think a lot about that, and what is lost. And these your books pair so well together, because you talk about how we relate to the environment and vice versa, and the dangers in losing that. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that anecdote. I have a distinct memory of driving in northern Michigan, but it wasn't. Is Traverse City in the UP?
That's the lower part, but
Yeah,
it's
okay.
north. Yeah, it's beautiful.
But driving through, and this was actually in the era that I write about in this book, and you're going through forests, and you're noticing that the forests are all planted in perfect rows, because that had, what appeared to be fully grown and developed forest was actually replanted from logging of the late 19th century or early 20th century. So we see these phases of it's really conflict over land. It's you have a certain idea of the land and what it means to you, and how it's important to you, and someone else does too. They see it as a resource. And so we have all these over and over again in American history, these clashes of value about what the land means. It's most particular, of course, when we talk about in the indigenous context, what the land means, and what it meant to the European people who colonized those areas, was so very different. And so what I'm trying to do here is I'm just looking for ways of interpreting what we're seeing and how we relate, so that we can have a language for talking about loss, talking about change. Because the fact is, even if there's no human hand involved, there's no logging company that's going to come and one day take away your beautiful hike. Earth systems are always changing anyway, even though we've come from this rather lengthy era of stable Earth systems. They're always changing, and all beings are on the move, and this is what evolution is. This is what adaptation, this wonderful thing called adaptation, is. So we have to get used to that too. We've just accelerated. That's the only problem.
Thank you. And that takes me to Douglas, your question. It's a wonderful question in the chat. Would you like to unmute and just pop in? And
Sure. I've read Nathaniel's book. In fact, I'm the publisher of it. It had never occurred to me as he was just reading. I thought the beginning of Genesis, or not quite the beginning. I think it's chapter 21, where it's expressed that God created human beings and so that they could have dominion over the earth, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over all the other animals. And so if that idea of the earth being ours to dominate and do with what we please goes back more than 2 millennia, how can we overcome it? I mean, there were certain societies that did not develop in this Western tradition, like Native American societies, I guess, that had respect for the earth. But if it's so embedded in our tradition, in European tradition, in everything that draws from that, I don't know. It begins to seem that we would have to undergo a revolution in our basic concept of ourselves.
It's absolutely, it's funny that, Doug, that you have this recollection now, or this, you're recognizing this now in the text which you have spent hours and hours laboring over. But I would say that there are many theorists, and one of them, and I'll talk about him in my next reading in a few minutes after Jesse reads again. Timothy Morton is a philosopher, and he says he draws all of this relationship, the relationship you just described, which comes from what we call the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that is enclosure of space, domestication of animals. It aligns with the creation of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and he draws this, our present day relationship, which is one of distance to nature, man and nature, to that, and theorizes that the only way, we're not going to save the earth by our own small habitual actions. What we have to do is change our mindset about how we relate to the earth, that is undoing that 14,000-year-old system of enclosure, which could be impossible, of course, very likely is. But it's, and he uses the term of he envisions that we could reimagine, instead of the kind of enclosure control model, one of a mesh in which we're all integrated into the living systems, very similarly to how indigenous societies think of, and I write about this as well, think of the forest and the way the forest functions and the way the human beings are situated within that forest. But I think what Jesse tells us is that human beings are complicated and difficult and self-centered and needy and hungry and pleasure-seeking, and all of those things get in the way of, they just are what we are.
I was kind of thinking about this when I was looking over your book. I was drawn to that chapter that you actually read from today when you talk about I am not a commodity. It made me sort of think about, I was going to ask you this about sort of like how, of course, the capitalist system that we live in sort of makes us think of ourselves as a commodity, because we're in the capitalist system. Our labor is used by the capitalist system, and it becomes sort of like points and profit margins for shareholders and stuff. But I wonder where the individual accountability is from individual human beings, because it seems like most people live their lives basically as consumers. They go home, they watch TV, they consume TV rather than doing something that's generative or interactive. They're consumers in how they eat their food. They either buy pre-prepared food, pre-packaged food that's already made, or processed food, rather than sort of growing their own food. So where do you think the sort of like individual accountability is for how people live their lives?
I spent a lot of the book on this very subject, of trying to understand the individual's moral responsibility or moral standing within this huge thing, because all of what you said is very true, and the way in which global capitalism has sort of transformed us from beings with hearts and minds and desires and needs, and that relate directly to the systems of the earth, to points on a consumption chart, and or even us who write, we're content provider. There's ways of framing what we do that just lines up into the profit-making capitalist system. I spend some time thinking about that, but I also think that most people want to do what's right. We have a moral dimension to ourselves, maybe it comes from that religious tradition that Doug spoke about. In part, for some people it might, for others it has nothing at all to do with that. But we have a virtuous, and we can be very virtuous as much as we can be very selfish. We can be active and intentional with our virtue as much as we can be passive consumers, not thinking about the way we're living our lives. And it seems to me this is one of our great struggles right now, is because we want to do the right thing, and yet what is before us, this collective, slow moving, yet astonishingly fast disaster that's happening to the earth, that we share and we contribute to the problems that are being created, but each one of us has nothing to do with it. Each one of how you live your life, earth matters not. It's not going to add up to anything, but collectively we do. And yet we also all relate to a political and economic system that makes decisions beyond us. It's a really difficult moral place to be. That's why I talk about the Holocaust and the way that Primo Levi thinks of the experience of the Holocaust, and the way that Hannah Arendt conceptualizes the responsibility of everyday Germans in Nazism. They went along with it. She described them as the most slippery kind of criminals. And in a sense, we are just the same. And in that sense, I see us, those of us who contribute to the collective disaster that's being created, as kind of like, we're pretty slippery criminals ourselves, but we're also doing the harm to ourselves. We're the murderer and the person being murdered. And it's just a really weird moral place to be. And it's upsetting to me. That's why I wrote this book, because I don't really know what to do with that strange feeling.
Yeah, that's great discussion. Jesse, let's go back to your book and see how that translates, what we've been talking about, how that translates into your next reading.
All right. So Christine, I think, is going to sort of screen share table 2.1 for us here. I kind of wanted people to be able to just see how this poem looks on the page. What I was doing was, and I talked about this earlier, was I was looking through sort of different textbooks and taking charts from them and reappropriating those charts into poems. So I'm going to read from table 2.1. So table 2.1, gas, carbon dioxide, CO2, activities causing emissions, primarily fossil fuel burning, secondarily deforestation, affected area. My father has worked on a logging outfit for a little over a decade. When he was in his 20s, though, he foremaned on a hotshot crew called the Helen of Troyes, which navigated the burned up bottoms of forests around the Pacific Northwest, hacking through old growth, lighting backfires in huckleberry brush. Now, when the sun goes down late in the evening, sky fumes around his house, and he begins to sweat, reaching to where a hatchet used to hang on his overalls. Every day, he drives a backhoe through a section of land clear enough so that the remaining stumps look like the stubble on a man's face. He drinks RC cola in the heat and thinks it's unusual. He used to ache up a mountain after an aspen grove and now can barely stand to sit on a felled sequoia at lunch. His new crew, he knows, will shortly turn his seat into a 2x4. Some people chase a fire long enough the heat consumes them. Chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, refrigerators, foam insulation and packing, previously spray cans, now banned. Wearing a fishing cap with a treble hook snared in its mesh, my little brother, Marcellus, sprays a ladybug with a can of Lysol. In a puddle of chemicals, the bug writhes. Marcellus flags over the insect, leaning back and forth so his shadow swallows and regurgitates it. Across the yard, my father is dumping a busted refrigerator into the back of Jerry's truck. Jerry is my father's younger brother. A few nights ago, Jerry climbed into Marcellus's window. It was 3 a.m. and he was drunk and had mistaken the window for that of my mother's office. When Marcellus opened his eyes, he smelled perspiration like Lysol, and he saw Jerry's face, strained and pale, his belly smeared against the sill. Jerry flicked his arms and legs, struggling to gain ground. Marcellus drops the spray can. Be quiet, Marcellus says, leaning his lips near the ladybug. You don't want to wake your father. Methane, CH4, rice paddies, ruminant animals, coal mining, natural gas leaks, landfills. Standing at the kitchen window, Jerry seams apart curtains made from an old tablecloth. He holds a bologna and mayo sandwich. He hasn't taken a bite, but is instead panning across the field at the landfill. Sunlight fumigates over steel cars, refrigerators, and empty spray cans. Above the piles, clouds clot a greenish gray. When Jerry was a young GI stationed near Hanoi, he stalked along a marsh beside rice paddies and smelled the aroma of a trash bag's plastic lining. From the rice stalks, a Viet Cong sprouted, arms raised. In his hand, a silver sickle mirrored the foliage. If Jerry hadn't stopped to sniff whatever chemical fled over the water, the blade would have plucked his temple, but instead hit the sergeant walking beside him. Jerry curtained the sergeant in his arms and blood oiled in the man's stubble. In the field across from Jerry's kitchen window, a cow chews regurgitated grass. Jerry thinks cows are disgusting creatures, and he can remember a few months after he was shipped home, working as a coal miner in Balua when an Angus wandered into the road. In North Dakota, roads can lead everywhere and nowhere, and in some places you are lucky to see a house every 15 miles. When he hit the cow, his foreman was riding shotgun. The cow was kept by the man who outfitted their mining operation, and both Jerry and the foreman knew, if reported, the worth of beef would be taken from their pay. Tired from working the brunt end of a 7-on stretch, they loaded the steer, heavy as several refrigerators, into the truck bed and drove into the mountains. They delivered the animal into an abandoned shaft, listening to wind friction over the cow's body, the wind like the whistle of a coal worker who's happy he's not starving. Nitrous oxide, N2O, nitrogenous fertilizers, burning fossil fuels, and biomass. Jerry sits on my father's tractor, eating the lunch my mother made, looking out over the land my grandfather allotted to the oldest son. Past the sweet potato rows, mountains rhodotil blue sky. Above their ridges, a cowtail of clouds stretch. For the last 3 hours, Jerry spread fertilizer, his shirt brown from sweat. When he bites a sandwich, he tastes exhaust and he turns off the ignition and waits for the fumes to clear. While at GI, he once stepped into a village and was suddenly hit with a white phosphorus bomb. For a moment, the smoke was so thick he could feel it in his ears. In the field that morning, the tractor kicked up enough dirt that he had to wrap a handkerchief around his mouth. When he stopped the tractor, his tongue was still coated in dust. Taking a bite of his sandwich, he tastes dirt and processed pork and remembers in Hanoi how the smoke cleared and he heard an explosion, the collapse of huts, water troughs tipping over, oxen and roosters scurrying into brush, men exposing noise from their throats. A fertilizer bomb turns a moment into corpses. Those too severed to be sent home were planted into the Hanoi soil. Often now, Jerry dreams that his friends shoot up, half human, half plant material, and live among the villagers, eating stones and straw, drinking pond water beside oxen. They are waiting out humanity's extinction. Jerry starts the tractor and its engine shudders. A platoon of birds, so large they cover the canopy, lift the field and demand the sky.
Oh, thank you. I love the form of that. And again, you just paint such vivid images. The things that stood out to me when you were reading, Nathaniel read about senses are an illusion. And that piece that you wrote leans towards senses create the illusion of memory. Everything, it's just so amazing reading about this man Jerry, and everything he sees, everything he smells just brings it all back. Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah, I wanted those things to control the language, and then also sort of like the makeup of the charts to control the details that would go into the individual poems and stuff like that.
I love that. And I'm just thinking again about, the way that these two books come together about environment and relationships and living with intention, as Nathaniel was saying, and living with intention, whether it's around the things around us in the environment or the people around us and everything in between. It's just it's really great when you see literature from two people who don't know each other, who've written about similar themes coming together in such a great way. One thing I did want to ask Jesse, and you haven't read any of these poems, but what I noticed when I was looking through your book is the repetition of the word floret. And, your cover speaks to that as well. Some of your poems are floret as water, floret as phosphorus, floret as bird. I would love to know a little bit more about florets, how you, I don't know, just how it's woven throughout your poetry in that repetitious way.
Yeah, that's probably the main sort of driving force behind the book. So the idea of the floret is that the floret's the individual flower that makes up the components of the larger flower. So sunflowers themselves have the individual florets inside them, and then these sort of things make up with other things like the petals and stuff like that, the larger flowers. So the book is sort of driven by this idea that the book as a whole is complete, but each of the sort of poems and each of the poems within the poems are their own little florets that have their own individual worth, but are also sort of part of the larger whole. And then that sort of plays into sort of different ideas in our society where that plays into account too.
Thank you. That's a great image. So Nathaniel, let's go back to your book and your next reading now and see, it just seems that everything's sort of flowing back and forth in a nice organic way.
Truly, truly, truly. So we're going to go to a moment of intention that may not have worked out so well. And since we just celebrated Earth Day, I thought I would read a little bit about Earth Day 1990, which was actually the second Earth Day and the 20th anniversary of the first one. And we'll get into something called hyperobjects, which is a menacing term in a way. What then, and this is from much earlier in the book than the other passage, and it was inspired by what Jesse read just now. What then did I mean to accomplish celebrating Earth Day 1990? Was it the ozone layer or loss of wetlands, or the proliferation of trash barges, or clear cutting the Amazon rainforest, or the toxicity of lawn chemicals, or even the incipient worry over greenhouse gases that needed addressing? There was no larger movement underway. So on our own, we planted trees in a city park, even as our classmates back on campus, acting out a junior year rite of passage called Hay Day, wore roaring 20s boater hats, then tossed them in the air and smashed them into the ground. A symbol of blind optimism, these hats were made of some kind of polystyrene foam. In the life of the neighborhood where the tree planting and the hat ritual took place, I'm not sure which act was more presumptuous. Did the park need more trees? Did the neighbors demand them? Had anyone considered their care? I had raised the money for them and organized people to dig the holes, but the scene, in memory at least, soon flooded with foam chunks, carried on wind and tossed along by passing cars from campus through the streets all the way to the park. Not caring had been the state religion of the 1980s. In 1990, it was impossible to discern any change. The afternoon gave way to evening. Plastic foam clung to everything. The Dow Chemical Company produced product styrofoam, and other types of polystyrene were ubiquitous back then, and incredibly are still used today. American coffee, that thin and bitter black water, would eat through a foam cup like mineral spirits. As a kid, I learned never to use one to clean a paintbrush. We haven't ever reckoned with the invasion of its synthetic chemicals and plastics that as alien beings have penetrated every surface of life, the totality of it like an act of contagion. Right around the time of the collegiate hat ritual, polystyrene foam had emerged as a villain, an easy symbol of mass degradation of the environment, precisely because scientists said it wouldn't ever degrade. In a landfill not for 1,000,000 years, busted up, it released a bonding agent, chlorofluorocarbon. When emitted en masse, CFCs were burning a hole in the ozone layer, exposing beings to harmful sun radiation. The philosopher Timothy Morton gave this kind of phenomenon, which exists far beyond our capacity to comprehend, in scale and in kind, a name: hyperobject, because it breaks down into infinite particles, unpredictably invading sectors and dimensions of the biosphere immediately, and then as microns for thousands or millions of years. All the plastic in all the world is a hyperobject. And so is global warming. Hyperobjects envelop us, wrote Morton in his book, Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World. Yet they are so massively distributed in time that they seem to taper off like a long street stretched into the distance. A single mind can barely conceive it. Hyperobjects are thus fundamentally destabilizing because they so massively outscale us. Hyperobjects have magnified this weirdness of things for our inspection. Things are themselves, but we can't point at them directly. I am myself, but I can't point to me directly. Not if I wish to take into account family history, genes, DNA, chemical accidents, or the swarm of bacteria who share my being. Morton put it this way: the gap between phenomenon and thing yawns open, disturbing my sense of presence and being in the world. Like a predator, polystyrene foam stalked my Earth Day 2 demonstration. Something truly weird and foreign had invaded the landscape, plastics only existing en masse since the 1950s. My response was to point to what I could see: infinite broken foam particles seeping into newly dug tree pits, indicating injury to Earth, or in keeping with Morton's terminology, that something just wasn't right. This is how in those days I perceived such pollution or mining or the filling of wetlands as predatory acts of the powerful against the powerless, acts of injustice. The earth and its beings had to be protected from mortal injury. It had to be taken, in the words of the poet Farooq Farrokhzad, I had discovered much later, to a hospital. The instinct to act was thus an instinct of love. The problem has always been to reconcile love, which derives from and demands intimacy, with the inconceivability of living on a large balloon spinning in space, where life is a chemical accident. How is it possible to love a hyperobject?
That's great. Thank you. I was just writing that last part about love demands intimacy, and how much intimacy we lose. There's a great book that the two of you would probably like. It's called A Walking Life. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. You're saying, yeah,
Yeah.
by uh, Antonia Malchik. And there's a quote from it that I love. She writes, "We walk to find our prophets, our guides, our ancestors, but ourselves most of all, and through ourselves we find one another." And that's what you're talking about, and just that finding that intimacy again. And I'm thinking again about what you said before about living with intention and how we contribute to the collective, whether it's the collective of destruction or the collective of repair. And yeah, it's just so much great food for thought, and great to have these conversations here tonight.
Well, it's a struggle, right? I mean, the way we relate to the earth mostly is like this. We garden, whatever we do, take a walk. You have your walk in the Upper Peninsula, whatever it is, we relate. And in fact, every single thing we do, we're relating to the earth. But then there's this concept, the earth. And we know that through our collective actions as human beings, we're causing so much harm. That's the word you just used. Great word. And that's really an unbearable place to be. And it came sort of, it like hit me in that moment when I was just a 21-year-old kid trying to do what wanted to feel like ambitious point of activism, and it got all fucked up. It was, I mean, you can't control what day Earth Day is, and it was on the wrong day.
Yeah, I don't know, Jesse, if you have anything else that you'd like to add. We're getting towards the end of the hour, but I don't want to cut anybody off.
No, just thanks everybody again for coming. If there are any final questions, of course, people can ask them, but if not, thanks everybody for showing up to the reading. And thanks once again, Hidden Timber Books and Nathaniel for reading with me.
I had a quick question, and I think it's really interesting, the crossover between hyperobjects and florets. Really interesting crossover there. But Jesse, I was interested. I did environmental work in northern Idaho, and so I connect a lot with the different places in Idaho and ideas that you bring up. And I was curious if you could say more about how you chose those different places and things going on in Idaho for either the framing or format of the poems, or and kind of what was the origin of that? Like, did you have kind of an idea or question you were mulling over and connected it to something you remembered from growing up in Idaho, or what was sort of the order of that?
Well, I think that a lot of it, some of those stuff, like one of the poems I read today, the Field Guide to the Idaho Phosphate District, that came from specifically when I was sort of doing research and looking through different scientific forms that I could then take and appropriate. That was one of them that I had found, and that was the title of it. So that's where that stuff comes from. The other stuff came from, sort of just generative work as I was writing, or a lot of it probably came from redrafting. A lot of times, a lot of parts in the poems, they're sort of like where the little smaller floret poems will interrupt the larger poem. The speaker will have to sort of readjust and start over from where he was talking about before as those interruptions happen. But all of those interruptions happened in redrafting. So like the first couple of poems in the book were in their first draft, just those original left aligned poems. But in sort of the redrafting, when I was thinking about interruption, those parts came in, and probably some of the other parts about sort of my times in Idaho and stuff like that.
That's a great question. Thank you. The one thing I want to say really quickly before we go, I love that you use different forms, and I think writing in different forms and appropriating different forms is such a great way for authors to open up doors of connection for readers. The title of your book, The Amateur Scientist Notebook, it makes it feel accessible to someone like me. And then when you talk about florets and how they work, it makes, so the way that you weave that science into just real life just presents a whole new layer of meaning for someone like me, who's maybe not as familiar with certain things, but I can certainly enjoy that. So thank you. And I just want to remind everyone, the links in the chat box, you can check out Jesse DeLong's book from Baobab Press and Nathaniel Popkin's book from Next Door Books. So thank you, Doug, for being a part of this tonight. I'm glad that you were here as well. And, the themes that stand out are those of changing our mindset and living with intention and paying attention to how the landscape really works for us and with us. So thank you so much for both of you being here and everyone for joining us tonight. I hope to see you all again. You can watch for the recording on our YouTube channel, and I hope you stop by hiddentimberbooks.com for some more readings coming down the line. And hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to be here.
Thank you.